Hello and welcome to another random code stream. My name is Jason Bach, as you would know, because that's the name of my channel. So I'm going to start working on this issue in Rocks. And it's a feature, not a bug. Actually, I got to move my, hey Mitch, I got to move my camera down here because I forgot to do that. I was just trying to get on the stream and I didn't get everything set up quite correctly. I'm also going to get some music going in the background. All right, so this is probably going to be one of many streams. Hopefully not as many as it's taking me to get through Silk Song, because I think I'm up to, what, 30 now streams on that? And there's so much more to do in that game. So this is going to take a fair amount of work to get done. Hopefully it's not too much, but I think the big thing is going to be the tests. Honestly, I think the tests are going to be just a lot of change, because whenever I do a change like this that can change the output of what Rocks does in a fundamental way, I mean, it happens in pretty much every test, every scenario, I got to go back and change every single test because the outputted code is different. And I use these test assemblies from Microsoft to basically do like snapshot testing. It says, this is the code that I expected to be outputted. What is the code that's outputted? And then tell you what the difference is between the two, if there's unexpected differences. So it gets to be just like monotonous to, spend hours updating all these tests. But that is something I would do off screen. If I felt like I got the work done, then I would just go through and do that off screen. But what is this that I'm hinting at? What is this that I get up on my screen here? So I have been, the one thing I've gotten feedback, and not just from Mitch, it's happened from a couple of other people as well, is the API that Rocks generates for, hopefully it'll be worth it in the end. I hope so. I'll also say this is the last time I'm going to make a change in Rox's, that's a odd way of saying it, but the API that Rox generates in its source generator. I can't keep doing this. So I'll make changes. I mean, I'll make changes if there's like new features and stuff like that, but I'm not going to go through and change all this again, because I've done that a couple times with Rocks where I've made these like wide sweeping changes, and I just don't want to keep doing that. This is also going to be a breaking change. So I'm at the point with Rocks where, we're actually starting to use it a little bit more internally, not a lot at where I work, but it's being used on a couple of test projects. It's, Mitch is on the chat. He's using it. I know a couple of other people's using it. So I'm like, if there's a time to change it such that it breaks people, this is now, rather than, I'm not saying it's going to get popular, but if more people would start to use it, or if this is holding people back going, I don't get this, I don't understand how this actually works, then I'd like to do this now and then basically commit to that for all eternity. So what is this? Well, in Rocks, when you say when I want to mock a type, like just let's say I had an interface called idStuff, sits somewhere, and then I put this attribute that says I want to be able to mock it. What Rocks does is creates a class, and it has this naming convention, create expectations. Okay, that's all fine and good. And then what Rocks does is says, well, you could mock a method. You could mock this property called name. And so what it does is it says, well, excuse me, I literally just woke up. It says, okay, well, what you want to do is you want to set expectations within the methods, the one called run this. I want to set an expectation on the property getter for name. And so in some ways it's pretty explicit in terms of this is what I want to do. And of course it'd be indexers too. If there was an indexer, it'd be expectations.indexers.getters. And then I put this there because it's the keyword in C# for an indexer is this. So I'd actually will emit this as the name. Okay, and then you can specify the return value. You can specify a callback if you want. You can specify the expected call count is another thing. So there's other things that you can now set on that expectation. Okay, and then you create a mock from it using expectations.instance. You pass that to the code under test, and then hopefully all your expectations pass. And the feedback I've gotten is this feels wordy. Now this actually came from, and I think it is from an old Twitter link that I put this in. This was years ago, and I thought I put that somewhere within Rox's documents. But this came from a conversation I actually had from somebody, I think at that conference in Wisconsin Dells. I think it was around 2018 or 2019. This is before source generators, and I showed the previous incantation of Rox where it was kind of using an almost verbatim copy of MOQ syntax. And he's like, oh, this is cool, because it would still generate C# code. It would just do it at runtime. He goes, but what I'd like to see is, instead of having all these expressions and stuff, is why don't you like have a way to qualify, hey, I want to do methods, and then I want to do this method, and the name shows up, and so it's even clearer. And I was like, oh, I really like that. I thought that was a really interesting idea. And so it actually, it differentiated this from other mocking frameworks, but I thought it actually made things clear in my mind. I still think that's true, but I also understand it is a little wordy. So I started thinking, and other people have prompted me on this, is to go, can we make this a little bit easier, smaller, more apparent? And so the idea is to get rid of all these qualifiers so that you'd end up having something like this. And I'll show an example of this in just a moment. And so if I want to set an expectation on run this, I would just .run this. And then this would still be able to say return value or callback or expected call count. If I have a property, it would actually have the property syntax here. And you can debate whether this should be return value or gets. We'll get to that in a moment. And then an indexer would actually be specified as an indexer. I expect that when the indexer is called with these values, I expect that the set's going to be called with this value, or it's going to return, or if somebody wants it to be returning a value, the getter is being called. Okay. And so that's the general idea, is to come up with a way to potentially reduce the noise. And I thought I'd do it after the 10.0 release, but I'm like, no, I think this is the right time to do it right now. So there's no plan of when 10's coming out. I would like it to come out by the end of this year, if not sooner. So I don't want to rush this, but I don't want this to go on for months either. So I think, yeah, so then I started playing with more ideas, and I thought, with the method, you do this. With the property, you would say, I expect that the property is going to be called where it needs to return something. So it's the gets, although this wouldn't be here. Okay. And then the sets is saying, I expect the set to be called with this value. And then when the setter's called, here's the callback, and I can do some validation in there. Okay. So, and then I also want to have a document that says if you're using the old syntax to move to the new one. I will also want this to be somewhat easy to move to. I know Mitch is watching, but I mentioned maybe about writing analyzers or code fixes for this. That would also be a lot of work, though. I would like it to be something where I have a document that describes the things that you need to change, and maybe that can be used as a way for you to add that to like a Copilot session as a context document or something to say, hey, I want to change my test code that uses Rox, and it uses the instructions in that document to say, oh, if you have .methods on an expectation, just remove that. If you have properties getters, property setters, remove that. That's another thing I want to keep in mind here, is that I want this to be as easy as possible to get up to what the new syntax is. So if this, that's not the overarching driving thing either, but I don't want it to be a barrier to people that are currently using this to say, my God, this is so different. It's going to take too much for me to change. That is something I do want to keep in mind, because again, we are using this a little bit internally where we work, and I don't want to make it too difficult for people to go, well, that's too much work, I'm just never going to update, And then if they find bugs in a previous version, it's like, well, I'm not that interested in trying to go back and say, well, 9.3 is the current version. I don't want to do like a 9.3.1, go back to that and do an update just for that. I do have to be more conscious, though, of from 10.0 on, that's going to be where I think, yes, that's going to target. The code is going to basically say we're targeting .NET 10. But after that, I do need to be a little bit more conscious of how do I roll forward and how do I be a little bit more flexible with potentially doing things where somebody could stick on a previous version and still fix a bug or something like that. In any event, so that's the intent here, is to just make this syntax a little bit smaller. Okay. So the nice thing about using a source generator is that you have code that's actually generated. And so what I did is I made, let's close these out. Actually, let me do something here real quick. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Because Mitch brought up something else about tests, which I want to talk about just a little bit. Okay, so then what I did is I basically used some code that's generated in my current tests and then moved things around to say, what would it take to make this actually happen? So I'll go through this code in just a moment. The end result is this. So this little experiment is using all the stuff from rocks, except that expectation stuff has now changed. So you can see for this interface with these methods, properties, and indexer, I can now set the expectations on the method, on the properties, and on the indexer. This stuff is all the same. None of that changes. So that's still all the same. And if I would, for example, on the indexer, say I'm setting this to 78, and I would run this, what I'm going to get, I think, is an expectations exception. Or expectation. Okay. So this is saying that in line 30, it should be here. Yeah, 30. That this was incorrect and that you passed in these values. This is what was set, and so you get the error as expected. That's not what I expected to happen. If I change it and then I run it, everything works and we don't get an exception, which is great. So what did I do? One of the minor reasons I prefer return value over gets is that I can imagine at some point I may find a property interface that should be a method. We might should find and replace method name with method name solution might. Yeah, sure. But that's not a goal really for me. If that's what somebody does because they're refactoring code, I get it. But you'd have to change, if I make get and set data a method, there's this level of indirection that has to be changed. But I'm like, then you'd literally do this. I mean, that took me half a second to do. There's only so much that I want to be cognizant of, if that's the right phrase, if that's the right thing I'm thinking of. I mean, I get your point, but that's also something that's like, well, there's only so much I can do if somebody's changing their code. There's a part of this too, and I'll get to this because Mitch mentioned it. There's gets and sets, and then there'd be an inits if you have an init on the property or indexer, is kind of a consistency thing to say on this property, what do I do? Do I expect it to be the getter to be called? Do I expect the setter to be called? And then from there, now I can say like the adorn. These are things that are called adornments. If you look at gets here, you can see it's returning this thing called an adornments. And these are just things that are added on as extra little things. I couldn't think of a better word when I was creating this. So I looked this up. I think adorn means to like decorate or add on to or something. So that's where it's like I'm adding on that I'm expecting return value, or it's being called 5 times. Just wonder if the gets adds any benefit. Well, again, this is what I'm getting at because I think it does in my mind. So again, let me go through what I did in the underlying code, and then we'll come back to this. So this is all the generated stuff. So this is like internal stuff to rocks, but it's important to understand for at least me making this new change. If you look at the code that's generated for rocks originally, I get it. You're excited about this, bitch. So, I mean, I am too. I think this will be a better change in the long run. So, but okay. So what changes is that these things that are in these extra classes that are made by rocks now go directly on the expectations. This code internally hardly changes other than it's now using just this dot because it's on the expectations type. And then it returns a new handler and everything flows from there. So it's really just moving these directly onto the expectations type. Okay. So that is not an easy, I mean, that's changing that's changing code that's being built internally, but that's fine. The property expectations needs a little bit of an indirection, at least the way I'm doing it right now, because I need to be able to say, do you want to set an expectation for the getter or the setter? Okay. And so this needs to be a type that takes the expectations as a parent reference so that it can now reference the handlers that are generated below. You'll see that in a moment. Okay. But then from getter setter, it's all the same. And then this is the thing that's set in the code that relates to the property get and set data here. Okay. The same thing with indexers. Now this is interesting because the name, there is no name for an indexer. It's just this. But if you had multiple indexers on a type, they're all named this. If you want to think about it that way. So there's no differentiating name between them. And so what I do, or what I'm planning on doing, is with an indexer is just indexing them literally by like an int 0, 1, 2 as I run into them. Okay. And so I'll generate this class. I have to capture all the arguments that are being passed in to the indexer expectations so that I can then make, for the gets and sets, I can make the right handler passing in the values that were being passed into the indexer. Same thing if it's a setter here. Okay. And then I have down here the this with the arguments, and that would just have a getter that returns an instance of this expectations type. And that translates into this call here. Okay. So that all works. Now, from this point on here, all of this is exactly the same. None of this changes. Okay. The adornments, everything else is exactly the same. None of that will change. So that's actually nice. What I am going to do is that there's some expectation classes that were built down here are effectively, I don't have to put them here. The location of where they exist in the class doesn't matter, but I'm going to put them up here because to me, it's like, that's the first thing that's being done. And it just gets restructured in a sense so that it's up here. So actually it's hopefully doing a little bit of mostly just moving things around, but it actually ends up reducing the noise. Okay. Now there's also one other thing to keep in mind is that if a type requires explicit implementation. And that can happen. You have an interface that derives from two interfaces. Both of them have like the same method. Do this. You need to do explicit implementation in that case. And that's handled by rocks already. That's not a, excuse me, that's not a big thing. What happens in that case, so if I go to one of my tests, is I should have, yeah, explicit implementation. So like you have one and you have two, and then you have this type that derives from the two, and this is the thing I want to mock. What happens is rocks will put in this property in between. This is what it's doing right now, and say explicit methods for, explicit properties for, explicit indexers for what type. Because what's going to happen on the actual mock is it's going to do an explicit implementation of these two interfaces. It has to, because it needs to differentiate between the two. So what I'm going to do is basically eliminate the methods, properties, indexers here, and just say explicit for whatever interface it is. And then at that point, it's going to then use the same syntax that you see here. Okay. So effectively, the idea is that when I'm generating all this code in rocks, I'm going to generate all the methods, all the property stuff, and this within some kind of like general context member generation. And that will basically have to say, well, if these are needed to be implemented explicitly for a given type, then it will put this stuff within another container class, if you want to think of it that way. That might be really hard to visualize or understand, but that gives you that level of indirection. And explicit implementation isn't done a lot. It just, if it comes up, rocks can handle it. But that's the idea that I'm going to do in rocks, is to either say they're done directly on the expectation type, or these are done on some intermediate type that's used for explicit implementation. That will be more obvious in some future part of this series when I get to that point, because again, this is going to take some time to get all done. There are things called shims that I create in rocks that are generated if you have default interface members. I don't believe any of that will be affected by this, because this is all about just setting the expectations. The shims are created such that if you don't put in a expectation for a method that has a default implementation, it will work in rocks. What rocks will do then is basically call that implementation on the interface, and it uses a shim type, and that's a detail that you don't have to care about in rocks to make that happen. It just works from your perspective in a user of C#. I'm sorry, a user of rocks. None of that should be affected, because that's actually a decision that's made in fact, let me just show you that. Why not? I can show these things, right? Because I got all these tests. Here's a shim test. Okay. So I have, you can notice here that this is actually an interface that has a method that technically has an implementation. It does nothing, but it has a method body. Okay. So if I look at the code here for perform, it jumps up to that. That's not what I meant. Let me go into the actual expectation type here. And again, this is what I love. Absolutely, even if you don't know anything about rocks or mocking or anything like that, this is one thing I absolutely love about source generators, as at least an author, is I can look directly at the C# code. And yeah, it's a little like, my God, you have fully qualified names. Well, that's a choice, because it makes it easier as the author of a source generator that you don't have to worry about namespaces and stuff like that. So there are things you do as an author of a source generator just to make it a little bit easier so that it can be used by multiple people. You usually also don't care about formatting, that it matches the exact format of the code that the user wants, because that's somewhat immaterial. They really shouldn't care. They're more caring about, does this actually work the way I want it to? Okay. But in any event, as an author, this is great, because I can actually just look at the C# code and go, oh yeah, this is what broke or doesn't work. If you're using IL generation, like MLQ and then substitute use for mocks, that becomes much harder because now you have to look at, well, what happens? And yeah, they're using Castle Dynamic Proxy, but still something has to generate that stuff. And if that doesn't work, it can be a nightmare to debug. This is much less of a nightmare because it's all C#. So this is also showing, like, you have these handlers. These are where it captures all the handlers for all the expectations you set. This is what does all the verification to make sure things are working. But you'll notice in here now that with the mock, I'm passing in, or I'm creating these shim types, or these, these extra shim types. Okay. And when I get to a method like perform, if you haven't set an expectation for it, what it does is it calls perform on this shim. Well, what does that do? Well, again, that's going to try to target that. What I actually mean is, I think it's Control F12. I sometimes forget, and this is 2026, so I would imagine it goes to yeah, it is Control F12. Okay, so this one. No, that's not, it's not doing what I want it to do. Hold on. The shim type should be generated. Here it is. Okay. So this is the thing that it's actually, no, not that. Sorry. So that's the adornments. That's the instance. Here it is. Here are the shim types. So these are just these little types that implement the interface that the mock type derives from. But you'll notice that it has no implementation here in this case, because the only methods on that type not explicit, we don't need that. We need okay, I'm getting a little lost here. Yeah, is just that they have default implementations. If it did have members that did not have default implementations, then that you'd actually see them show up here, and they'd do something. But I don't need to do that in this case. So what this effectively does when it does the redirection here is this ends up calling the default implementation on that interface. So then you don't have to set the implementation. Okay. But all of that, to tie that back to what I'm going to be doing right now, all of that doesn't matter in the sense that none of that should change. That should all just keep working. Just notice that file scope namespaces is that for a specific purpose, in part because file scope namespaces came after I did all this work in Rocks. I think. I don't remember I could be wrong on that. I don't remember exactly when file scope namespaces were added, but I don't think they were. I think they came after I did everything with source generation. So I just simply never went back and cared about it. I have thought about it. And what Mitch is getting at is, if I go back in here, well, these namespaces, these types, are there things that I could be doing here that could potentially be file scoped? I don't know if you can file scope a namespace. Can you do that? I know you can file scope a class or a type, but I thought the file keyword was for a type, not necessarily a namespace. Even if that was the case, this stuff needs to be seen by the user. You know, you don't necessarily know these types. Like if you look at the code here in the test, you don't see those types explicitly showing up here, but you still need them to be visible so you can see them in your code under test as a namespace test. Not sure I know what you're getting at, Mitch. Not the file access or monitor. Oh, you mean just this, where I don't have a block, where I'm just saying namespace here? the indentation. Oh, this. Okay, sorry. It took me a second to realize what you're getting at. Why don't I use file scope names? Okay, sorry. I was being dense. It took me a second to realize what you were getting at. I don't know. I don't remember. I guess technically it could be a file scope namespace. I think there's one thing with events. I don't remember exactly, but there's something with events that if you want to set up something with a, like I want to set up a expectation for events to raise a certain event, that code that's generated needs to be in a separate namespace. And so then you can't have two file scope namespaces within a file. Let me check that quick. So like in this case with this test, okay, so I have a type here that has a method and also has an event. So what I do is I say, I expect that when the method A is called, I want to raise the not event, okay, which is a silly name to call it, but that's what it wants to do. And then we create our mock, we set that this event is being set up here, and then we call A. What we should expect is that the event was called, and that's what this assertion is doing. Now, if we look at the code underneath the scenes, let me just see if I'm... No, I'm not. Okay. So this is what I was thinking is gets generated, are these dormant extensions. But those actually end up being in the same namespace. So I don't know. I mean, that's a separate thing. I guess as I'm going through and regenerating this, I could just make it a file scoped namespace. It's a very, very small thing, but I guess I could do that. I think that would be fine. But they can't, but also good idea with some of those types being file access modified too. Yeah, I thought of that. It could, is there some cases where some of these things could have just file scope? I don't think so, because again, you end up using all of them when you're using rocks in your test code. So you have to be able to see them. If there would be something that is just could just be seen internally within all this code, I could make it file scoped. But I don't think I've run into a case where that's true. So yeah, I guess this is another thing we can make. I'll put that in my notes of things to do here. The mocking code can be put. I'm trying to build a to-do list here as a plan to say this is what I need to do as I'm changing all this stuff. Namespace stuff. It would be. And that's just it's not going to change like the performance of rocks. It will change just a little bit of what the code is being generated by rocks, and that it doesn't have to do an indentation. It doesn't have to put that extra block in there. So it is a nice small little improvement. And since I'm going to be going through and changing all this, I might as well do that here. That is also something I thought about with the events. Since we brought up events, is there something that can be done with setting an expectation that an event is going to be called? I don't do that. What I do instead is I'm saying is that when a method or a property or whatever is being called, I'm saying I expect that I'm going to call this event. And that's what this is doing, saying these are the event for args that are going to be passed in. And so then what you have to do in your test is you got to make sure that event is set up, which that makes sense. I was just, and if you're doing this with a mocked method, you have to say, well, because it has no implementation per se, I wanted to make it easy to say, by the way, I expect that when this method is being called, that this event is going to be raised. So that will all probably stay the same. I don't see that changing. So yeah, now Mitch, I'm going to bring this up because you were talking about some of this stuff. So, and I did respond to some of these things. By the way, so first, and I think I responded to these things, but I noticed this too. I think there is a bug with NUnit with some of these tests, because what Mitch found out is that some of the tests aren't running. And I think they all have to be related to something with NUnit with test case, and that if you have a string that has an escaped single double quote in it, it's just not running it for some reason. And I think that might be an issue with NUnit, so I might have to report that to NUnit. But we should report a bug in Rocks, and then I can handle that by telling NUnit, hey, get your act together. You also mentioned too that Rocks may do something wrong where if the mock type itself, like if I go back here, I generate a type called mock that's private. That implements the thing you're trying to mock. Okay, that's great. Now that can be a class or that can be an interface. Those are two perfectly valid choices. You can't mock a struct because a struct is sealed, so that's not even an option. The thing though that Mitch is bringing up, and it is a good point, is that if the thing I'm trying to mock has something that is protected, what I'm putting here is that it should be a protected implementation. And I'm actually kind of surprised. I might not have a test for this, which would be really surprising, because that's one of the things that is actually an advantage that Rocks has. I am surprised I don't have a test for this. Protected. Let's just look in the current solution. Analyzer test. Non-public members. Okay, so here is one. Okay, so we have a class abstract. It has a protected. Here's a better example. So we have a test. It has a protected method. If we go down to, and then what's that called? That's called protected method. Hey, great name choice. So I'm going to equals two strings. Yeah, so I'm calling protected here. And you're saying that this is giving a CS0628. But when I run this test, it's not failing. And do I have a integration test? Non-public members. So here I have a public protected abstract do something. And if I look at the create expectations here, that's the constructor. Okay, sorry. If we go to an actual class, it is doing a protected, but I'm not getting that error for properties. If you have a protected get. Oh, so you're saying this only shows up for properties. Okay. Maybe I just don't have a test for that. I didn't run into that. If I'm going to give the answer that I usually see on the C# and Roslyn Discord channels, file a bug. If you can have a test case to show that this is what Rocks will do and that it gives an error, but that's a separate thing from the work I want to do here. That's something I should fix, but I don't want to track that here, because that's going to be another. This is just a general thing I try to keep in my head when I'm doing work, is you don't want to say, here's like my story. I'm thinking like an agile developer here, but which I've been doing. I mean, I've been doing software development now for 30 years. And around 2003, that was the first time I was on a project where we really, this is back in my consulting days, the client really, really, really wanted us to do all things agile. So we had stand-ups, we had a sprint every 2 weeks, we had all of our stories up as big Post-its in this room. We literally pair programmed, and this is what the client wanted. So we're like, okay, fine. And we actually had a build server. It didn't do deployment or anything, but it did build everything on a server. And we also wrote unit tests, which was a whole big thing. And one of the things I picked up from that project, many things, I learned a lot being on that project. And one of the things is keep your stories scoped. Like if you're building something, you're like, hey, maybe what we really should be doing is this, or, oh, I think that might be a problem. It's like, that's cool. Put that off as something else. Write that down. Say that's another thing to do. Maybe rewrite another story for that. But don't keep like trying to do everything within one story, because otherwise you'll never get this thing done. So yeah, posted the one-liner in Discord, put it in Rock's Playground. I use data and see. Don't need to do it now. Submit an issue. Yeah, that's fine. Just post a bug in the repository, and that is something I'll probably be able to fix before 10.0. So it hasn't come up yet. Nobody's noticed. But of course, the usage of this library isn't a lot. So there's only so many cases, and that's something I struggled with this whole library is I wanted to do everything correctly, which means basically if I have a type, whatever this type is, what are all the possible cases that you could run into that if you want to derive from it, how would you set up the code to derive from it? And that's something I've struggled with because there are tons of things that happen that even just putting attributes on certain things will cause rocks to fail because it will try to put it on the member and you're not supposed to, or stuff like that. So it's been a struggle. And so something like what Mitch just found out is with properties that are protected, like a protected set or protected get, that I'm generating the protected and I really shouldn't. But nobody ever runs into this, and I just don't find that out. You know what I mean? So actually, I thought that's an integration test, yeah, because I don't have a property here, but I thought maybe I did in my test with generators, non-public members. They're just members, but I don't have like with specific. Oh, I do. Do I? Here's one that has a internal get and then a protected set. Well, what does it do? So yeah, it puts protected here, and that's what I think Mitch is saying, but the test doesn't fail. So but the other thing, too, to keep in mind here is that these tests, I've noticed sometimes that these unit tests will pass. But when I actually do it as an integration test, it only happens if the prop is on an interface. Oh, okay. But sometimes I'll have the unit test pass, but when I do the thing in an actual integration test where it's really using it, it'll fail, which is kind of odd, but it's very, very rare, but it can happen. Oh, one other thing I should note, too, is like all this stream is going to be blabbing, but this is all important because I do not want to go down a path that I get down halfway through and I haven't thought through enough that all of a sudden, oh crap, none of this is going to work, and either I have to spend a whole bunch of time rewriting stuff or the idea is for naught and I got to stop. I've done that path numerous times in Rox's history, and it's painful. So I'm really trying. I don't want to do analysis paralysis, but I also don't. I want to think things through enough to go, this is viable. I think this will work. Oh yeah, that's what I wanted to go through. So if I go into my mock code dump, one other thing that's going to be a very minor change, but I just realized this, is as I'm going through things, and this is true, and this is you're going, you can build something, but if you don't actually use it, and you don't actually try to go through and say, what is this actually like to use this? You may not fully understand what you've built. And in this case, it's a very small thing. But with the properties, what I have been doing is I've been on the mock type, I put this member identifier on with a number. And the reason I do that is because if I don't find an expectation or whatever, then I throw this exception. And the way this exception is thrown is it gets the name of the thing, the member that is there. And so what I used to do is I actually would generate the name of the member here. And I realized, well, why am I putting that in the code that's generated? Because these are exceptional cases. You shouldn't run into these. So I'm generating code for no good reason. So what I did instead is I said, okay, let's actually use something that at runtime will use reflection to figure out which member has this identifier. Oh, it's this one. So then use reflection to just get a version of this member name using reflection. That's good enough. That's technically a little bit slower than having a hard-coded string here, but it also saves on generating that string here where you already have it up here. So this just will only run if you have an exception at runtime. So that's fine. But what I realized for properties is that I was putting them on the property as with a second parameter property accessor get, set, init, whatever. What I can do is put them right on the getters and setters and initters directly. I didn't realize that. So I can do that. And so while I'm changing this code, this is a small change. It doesn't affect users, but it's a slightly better way of doing this. So that's one thing I'm going to change with the generated code is for properties. These are going to be put directly on the accessors themselves. All right. That's almost an hour of just talking. Does anybody have any questions other than what the hell are you doing here? Now you like me, Jason, what are you doing? What is going on here? I know, Mitch, you had a whole bunch of stuff here about, you didn't like the gets, the sets, and nits. I understand that, but I'm like, and yeah, I knew this. I knew you couldn't set, and this isn't like a private conversation. This isn't a public channel. So you can see all this if you go to this Discord server. I have a Discord server for rocks. So this is where this discussion is all happening. So yeah, I knew that you either have a getter and or a setter or a knitter. So you can have get set, you can have get init, you can have set, or you can have init. So that's five possibilities. So option struct. That's not really an options. I mean, I get that it's, and then in a dormant interface, expect. Well, you wouldn't have this because you'd either have a getter or a knitter, or you'd have because you can have just a write-only property too. That's another thing to keep in mind. And not just, yeah, honestly, I did say rough. Fair enough. This looks like what? Maybe the simplest, drop gets and go return value. I did think about that. I do like the symmetry though of saying I want to handle the getter, I want to handle the setter, or I want to handle the emitter. You know, one other thing that isn't obvious here, but for me as a developer of rocks, what I'm really liking about this approach is with indexers. One thing I found out about indexers is that if you have an indexer, you can think of as just a method that takes arguments. Okay. So for example, if I go back to my program here and I'm calling an indexer here, setting it, the set is the interesting part, because when I declare the indexer like I am up here, this is looking like a method that takes an int and a string, but there's a setter here. And so that is set as, if you look in the actual IL that's generated for this indexer, that's the last parameter. The problem becomes if you'd actually have, I think you can have params here. You can have this as an optional parameter. How do you put a required parameter after an optional parameter? You can do it. There's actually ways in IL and with attributes to do it. But in rocks, very long story short, as I ran into this, it became quite problematic to handle this in rocks with setting the expectations the way you currently do them with indexers. What I have to do is put the value first and then all the arguments, which is not that clear. What I like about this new approach with indexers is that it says, I expect that an indexer is going to be called with these values, and that when with these values, and when that happens, I'm going to call the setter. I'm going to pass it 77. It separates those two things out. And that makes it, not just from rocks, I think it makes it clear as to what you're trying to do here as well. If you look at the current code for what's generated, and I probably have an example for this, I should. So you'll notice here, yeah, this is where it becomes really confusing, and I don't like this at all, but I didn't have a choice. Is even something as simple as not like having required's not, because I have to do the same thing every time. You'll notice under this here, let me zoom in and make it really clear, is that the first parameter is actually the value with the thing that you will be using to set this indexer. And then the second parameter is the thing that's being passed in as the first value to the indexer. And so down here, this is what satisfies that expectation. But it's confusing as hell to me. Even as an implementer of rocks, I don't like this. I have to document it. I have it in the markdown file. I have to explain it. And I'm like, it's not cool at all. I don't like this. With this new approach, it becomes much clearer in my mind what you're intending to do here. You're intending that I'm calling the indexer and I'm going to be setting this value when these parameters are passed in. Yeah, interesting but weird. It is. And I didn't realize that about indexers with the setter until I ran into some case with some library, because that's what I have. Getting back to, I mentioned this before in previous streams, I have this code generation test where this app it doesn't implement. It references all of these NuGet packages. And what I do is I basically automate a setup to say, look through all the tests in this NuGet package, or look through all the types in this NuGet package for all the ones that I could mock, generate the mock code. It doesn't actually try to exercise any of the mock code. It just says, does that build? And this has been so helpful in finding cases that I didn't expect. And one of them was, I think somebody had it, I can probably find it in Rox's history, but one of these libraries, I think, ended up creating an indexer that its last parameter was an optional, and Rox blew up on it. And so I had to figure out a way to get around that. This clears that up. That's one of the other things about this that may not seem obvious, but to me as an implementer, this gets so much clearer, especially with indexers. So yeah, I'm honestly, ironically, almost out of time. I've spent the whole first part talking about this, but in a way, this isn't too bad because I think I want to use this first part, just to discuss things, to talk about things in my mind. What is the right approach? And, Mitch, you did say some things here, a couple of other things, bugs that you found, to file, and we can take a look at those later. I have to admit though, unless I need to see a concrete example as to what to do instead of this. You've got some notes here, but I really need to understand what this actually looks like. Now, the first thing I'm going to work on are the methods, because those are the simpler things. Those are going to be the much simpler things because I'm effectively just moving stuff into here. So that won't take hopefully too much time. Then it'll be properties and indexers. And so if we need to have a better syntax there, I need to understand what that is. Ultimately, this is a benevolent dictatorship. I heard that phrase years ago, and I'm all for democracy. From a government perspective, I don't like dictators and I don't like kings. I'll just say that. Really don't like them. I like freedom. I like democracy. I like the ability for the government to be for the people and by the people. I don't want to get on a political soapbox here, but kind of is important to me. And that all makes sense. For an open source project or something like this, I heard the phrase benevolent dictatorship. And what that means is when you're building and evolving a repository and you're looking at new features or you're looking at changing things, that you want to be benevolent in the sense of you want to listen to people because they may have good ideas that may change the way you're thinking about something, and that can add to the conversation. So that's all good. The dictatorship is preventing analysis paralysis. It's saying at some point, somebody's got to make a decision and move forward. And by moving forward, maybe that means you don't do anything at all. Or you decide, I'm going to pick this approach. Maybe out of 10 people, 2 people don't like it, but you've got to pick one approach out of 3 or something like that. So that's where the dictatorship part comes in. It's like, look, some people aren't going to like this, and that's okay because you can't satisfy everybody 100% of the time. It's impossible. There's always going to be things that some people don't like, and that's okay. That's fine. I think the thing is, as long as people are heard, and I mean heard in a way that is truthfully hearing what people have to say and go, okay, I heard you. I understand your point. I just don't agree with it. And so that's what I want to do here is I want to make sure that I do listen like people like Mitch and other people and go, okay, I mean, that's why I'm making this whole change in the first place is because I heard from enough people going, I don't really like what Rox does. And so I finally realized, okay, I never was against it, but I was like, I wouldn't do it because of backwards compatibility and breaking people. But I've heard it from enough people to go, okay, maybe this is the right time to change it. So, I do listen. I still think sets could be equals and gets could be return value, but I won't let that slow down potential or down the line. Maybe there'll be a middle ground too. True, but I don't want to change what I'm doing right now and then have to change it again. I really, really don't want to do that. And I still think sets could be equals. I really don't see how. I think what Mitch is getting at is, if I go back to my program here, is, and this is going to fail, but if I want to say I want this property to be set to 33, that's my expectation. So I think and Mitch, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is that could be set to equals 30 or equals 33. But then how do you move to and I expect that to be called twice. And maybe this should be the third thing that's called. There is a feature that I put out on the Rocks issue board that I don't know if I'll ever do, but it's to add other features. And I know that other mocking frameworks have things like, it's not counting, it's ordering. So I expect this to be the first thing that's called. I expect this to be the second thing that's called. And I've really been loath to add something like that. But I've also thought maybe I can do it, but in a layered way so that you only get that code generated in if you want to have an ordering feature in Rocks. So the point of this Fluent API is to basically say, this, I want to do this, and then I want to do this, then I want to do this. Do that last. Well, the order of doing all these things is I'm going to do the methods first, and then I'm going to do the properties and indexers. Properties and indexers are effectively kind of the same thing, because in the sense of they have gets, sets, and inits. So it's like I got to at some point move to this. So I won't harp on about, I think regardless I'm much better, so I can't be too upset. Yeah. I mean, this would look arguably better, but there's nothing that you can dot off of after this point. And to say, I want to continue to set adornments on this expectation. I meant to the equals last. Oh. Yeah. I don't know. I'd struggle with that. Because it would not be the same thing then that you would see from these. I don't know. There's a part in my head that's going, there has to still be some kind of symmetry and consistency with what you're doing within Rocks. This is basically specifying that I'm expecting this method to be called. This is specifying, I'm trying to get it away from highlighting the expectations thing here. What I just highlighted, this is specifying that I'm expecting that the getter on this property is going to be called. That's what I'm trying to do with this syntax. And then what comes after this is some extra things. So yeah, let's just move on for now. I'm hoping that this is at least overall better than what currently exists in Rocks. Is it, I don't even want to say perfect, because that's not the right word. Are there some things that could arguably be done that are better? Maybe. Is that what somebody else would think is better? Maybe somebody else goes, oh my God, that's awful. Don't do that, please. That doesn't work in my head. Again, this is where you have to pick what is the best thing and just say that's the road we're going to go down. And ultimately, does this work? Yes, it's absolutely going to work. And it works really nicely for the indexers too, with the problem I mentioned before. I think overall, all of this is going to make that expectations API so much cleaner, so much nicer, and so much better to use than what's currently there. And I think it'll be more obvious, in my mind, because you're saying here, I'm creating expectations. So what are my expectations? I expect that this method is going to be called. I expect that the getter on this property is going to get called. The setter on this index is going to be called with this value. It's clearer, it's cleaner, and the other stuff is just wordy things that actually get in the way, especially with indexers. Because again, if I go back to an indexer example, to see how this is set up, you have to say expectations, indexers, getters, this. What's a this? That's not even what you end up seeing here, in actual real code. This looks a lot more like real code. This is what an indexer actually looks like. This is what a property actually looks like, So it's not the same thing, but it's much, much closer to what you really do in C# code. And for things like mock too, with property setters, MOQ, I think they do something like, I'll just use the word expectations here. They'll do something like set, or setup, and then you have to do like this and then say like E dot my prop is equal to 33 because they use expressions and it's like, blah, I don't want to do that. Definitely don't want to do that. And I know that's not what Mitch is saying, but you know, does this give consistency to the API? Does it make it cleaner? I think overall this is going to be a much better approach. So with that, I do need to get to my day job. The screen's over my left shoulder and get to work on some stuff there. So I really didn't get much of anything done in this stream. But I think this is all good discussion and setup for maybe tomorrow morning or Saturday morning. I actually start working on building all this stuff out. Because it's going to take a lot of streams. I think it's going to be, that's why I said part one, because this is going to take a fair amount. If I can get to the point where I feel like I'm confident enough that all the changes I've made will work, and then it just becomes a matter of changing all the integration tests and unit tests that would take me literally like a Saturday afternoon to get all done, I'll do that off camera. That is something I will not subject to people watching a stream, watching me change tests over and over again. That would be so boring. This isn't boring though. This is interesting stuff. But yeah, I want to get this to a point where I feel like this is the right thing to do. And I've also got to change documentation because all the documentation has to change in terms of the syntax that's there. So that's another effort I should track here. Is correct. Update all unit and integration tests. Run code gen tests and hope they work. Update all documentation such that it reflects the new syntax. And all my notes here are actually going into the repository as well. I try to, if I'm working on a feature or bug or whatever, I usually try to put in docs/notes an MD doc that just has random notes that I'm creating while I'm working on the thing. So these will be included as well, if anybody ever cares. But you know, this is also the list of things that I want to do to get this all put into place. So I will probably start on this Saturday morning. But at this point, I definitely do need to stop. So I want to thank everybody who's been watching, whether you're watching live or you watch this in the future. If you have not subscribed to the channel just yet, please do so. I would greatly appreciate it. I'm trying to get to 5,000 subscribers as my next goal, so any new subscription helps. So thank you for doing that in advance. If you already are a subscriber, I appreciate you for doing that. Again, the next code stream will probably be Saturday morning and maybe Sunday morning. I'm also going to be doing a gaming stream, playing more Silksong this afternoon. I'll probably be starting around 4 or 4:30 Central in the afternoon. So if that interests you, you can check that out as well. But with that, I'm going to end this stream. Thank you all for watching. Take care, and I hope to see you in the future.